the presses as legitimation criteria. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I was curious about your thoughts on the role of the rise of the independent curator, someone who seems to take a position outside of conventional institutions, although I realize that as, say, international biennales are the place that they're curating, that's a different kind of institution, but I also do see curators moving more flexibly between institutions without a particular allegiance to one or another. So I just wondered how that fits into your thoughts on curating.
Well, look, I would support, you know, I published with mainstream academic presses, okay? But I would have been very happy to publish with underground, you know, smart presses. You know, it's not the status of the press, it's the intelligence of the production process that matters. And insofar as independent curators understand these issues and are trying to put together new work, which in Deleuze's terminology really is an experimentation with how we see, how we think, how we feel, right? The great Kantian kind of triad. I'm all for it. The problem with it is that it's impossible for an independent curator, all but the rarest cases, to make a living at this, and consequently they have to retreat to institutions, right? So unfortunately, it's a real hit and miss, and it lacks public support. I spent many years moving around one way or another with the art world in Los Angeles. I was a resident academic in an art school, but I used to love to go to the openings and so on, you know, and it was rare to see any sort of critical independence, because people have the institution in the back of their mind. That's the source of recognition and approval. You know, and again, as long as, so the public doesn't know anything about that one, only a few other artists, which is a good thing again, but not enough.
I'd like to say something about museums, if I may.
Really? No, we have a
I'm sorry.
question first over here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first, I guess, disclaimer, I am completely ignorant of all these issues, so this might be a kind of a dated question, but, and also, from my perspective, I'm just a student, you know, in college, and I don't really know anything. But,
You're setting me up. I can feel it. You're setting me up.
in a way, I feel like really powerful, because me and my friends here are like part of a new generation of people who are going out and becoming part of the new academia or new world or whatever. And I was wondering if you have any ideas about, so there's these problems out there, right? Like there's these big institutions that is all controlling, and like people are censoring, all this stuff is going on. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, as you put it, like keeping the bubble bubbling, like keeping the turnover occurring, and maybe like removing some of the staleness that's around. I mean, it's not an easy solution, but that's the whole question here.
What can I say to that? I mean, we could talk about the social processes that have generated the paradoxes, contradictions, even oxymorons that we're all engaged with. Maybe your generation should pray for deflation. Really, pray for deflation. What is it that generates social mobility? All of the sociological, statistical indices in the United States indicate we're becoming a frozen society, locked in place. Less mobility than ever. And for professors, of course, you know, this has already happened. So, what? Deflation? Alternative spaces? The idealization of the nomadic life. I don't want to idealize Deleuze spends a lot of time promoting the idea of movement, the in-between, the betweens, in-between, and so on. I think these are all good things, but if I had a strategy to do this, you know, I would have a, well, I don't. All I can say in empathy with your situation is I do think life is much more interesting when the financial dimension is not in your face. or when intellectuals can say something and not be afraid of losing their job because they have offended the power that be at a cocktail party. On and on. Well, I mean, on and on and on and on and on and on. You know, this is not a simple problem, and it didn't begin yesterday. Yeah, which I'm not saying that from a historical point of view. I'm saying that simply from a kind of conceptual, structural point of view. This has been coming and happening for a long time. This whole issue of status in American democracy is so vexed. You know, questions of privilege and status and hierarchy, and especially that horrible, vexed, ruinous concept, recognition, right? And everything that flows into recognition. That one anecdote, it is very common. An assistant professor in history or anthropology or English, one article in a really prestigious journal counts a lot more than 6 or 7 smart articles in unrecognized journals or lesser recognized journals, because the recognition provided, right, knocks out the discussion, ends the discussion. This person has credibility. This object has credibility. This thing has credibility. Right? That's what we're really talking about in contemporary society. So until people are willing to take on the credibility issue, I want to make one last comment. My argument, I do have a serious argument about that. What Jean-Francois Lyotard described in 1979 as the incredulity of the meta-narratives, that the big stories of liberation, enlightenment, freedom, that the super narratives were incredible. In other words, after Nazism and many other kinds of processes, they didn't have any credibility built into them. This incredulity, as he put it, I think has now leaked down into many other dimensions of our social life. Okay, that would be the sociological argument I would make. Daniel.
Museums.
Museums.
There are museums and there are museums. There are curators and there are curators. And we support the latter of the two.
Yeah, I understand that. I get it.
But I don't need to say anymore. But
No, I'm not making a blanket attack on all. I'm just for dramatic purposes, you know, I'm bringing out, you know, what's extreme in Groys's argument to find out, well, what's the conceptual glue here?
But I find Groys really actually very mundane. I mean, paradox is a switch you can flip either way and is applicable in any institution. And so he applies it to museums. I find it in a very uninteresting, unproductive way. The couple of things that you said, and I'll be brief with this, with respect to curators, for example, who are now given this, transferred to this power of the artistic power, formerly the artistic power of experimentation. And then you said irresponsibility, as though in the Groysian paradigm, this were a fault or a lack. And whereas it seems it should be a celebration of the kind of experimentation that curators might permit themselves today, if they rethink the institution. Mm-hmm. And, you know, earlier I mentioned the example of better half, better 12. That is an argument against the historical recognition that you just mentioned, recognition as a problem, that every museum, you know, engages. Historically, we represent ourselves, have represented ourselves historically by all the great white male mid-20th century artists. And we feature in our catalogs and in our websites historically. That's the recognition, you know, problem of museums generally. Most museums do that. We can take that apart, we can look at it from an institutional point of view and question the history of recognition in an institution. So, I'm sorry, that's my counterexample to the Groysian reduction of museum, which I think to me is very old-fashioned.
Okay, fair enough. Any attempt to open up an institution or a kind of closed political environment, or I guess the core argument when you encounter these institutions, whether they're publishing houses, or whether they're museums or galleries and so on, anything that opens them up, anything that generates, you know, a little movement, conceptual movement, is a good thing. The larger problem is what happens to all that energy? What happens to those concepts? And for that, unfortunately, it's only when an institution recaptures and institutionalizes the alternative, institutionalizes the different, right? And Western society, America in particular, it seems trapped, locked into this push-pull, right? Which then means the privilege continues to the institutions.
Right.
That's all I'm saying about it.
Which is why the institution has to rethink itself and challenge itself continually.
Other questions? Yes.
Try to turn this into a question, but I mean, along the same lines of institutions, publishing houses, creative writing publications, right? That these smaller presses are dramatically dropping in numbers. We all have the ability to sort of publish or curate our own electronic media, which then actually seems to sort of reinforce, in a lot of ways, the need for some kind of institution that...
Gatekeeping?
I see. That's, okay, let's make that a question.
That's just one word.
Right, I know, but that's right. But that's the anthology, right? That you gatekeep out all these other important ideas, but then in this sort of ideal free expression world, what as academics then do we do with the infinite?
Okay. The problem is that as academics, we're trained in a discipline, and our first loyalty is to our discipline. The only thing all historians agree on is protect the territory called history departments.
Right.
Right? Now, that's got to change.
Yes.
Now, how do you get historians who don't care about history? Aha. Well, how do you get English professors who don't care about literature in the classical way of you know, drawing a moat around it and defending it as a rigid territory? All right. My own suspicion is that this question is going to be answered via the financial transformations coming in universities in the next 20 years, in which you're seeing it now in England. You're seeing cuts of 20 to 30% in the arts and humanities, and some people will just dig in and say, "Oh no! The arts and humanities make us human." And ridiculous argument, okay? But other people will say, "Okay, what's the opportunity here? All right, what's the opening here? All right, how can we generate interesting work that's not only critical but creative and experimental?" And you're going to see new things come, whether we like them or not. Again, it's a kind of foot race between new groups and pre-existing institutions. No, is that it?
No, Roland.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
In what way exactly do you mean that the arts and humanities is
No.
the idea that it makes us human is silly?
Well, I was being a little sarcastic. I mean, there's just so many examples in modern society where really well-educated people have done such horrible things.